Hey everyone. So I had a really interesting insight today, and it's funny because it's kind of like it's something that I've actually been saying for a while now. It was in a lot of ways it was the kind of the impulse that kind of launched this whole phase of my life, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute by that. But basically, what happened was I was listening to the Letting Go book by David Hawkins. I'm kind of slowly making my way through it. Such a brilliant book, by the way. If you have not checked it out, check out Letting Go by David Hawkins. It's spectacular. And he said something, he was talking about the letting go technique and in conjunction with psychotherapy. He was kind of comparing them because he is a psychotherapist or a psychologist, trained psychologist, and practiced that way for any number of years. But then he also sort of had this spiritual journey and this spiritual awakening that then led to a whole other way of approaching the world and the mind and people's problems. And basically what he talks about is, he talked about how the letting go technique is both, it can change the goals of psychotherapy, and it reframes it in the context, in a much larger context. And kind of the way he describes that difference is that the goal of psychotherapy is to go from an unhealthy egoic state, an unhealthily adjusted ego, to a more healthily adjusted ego. And I think that that's largely accurate. I mean, that's my experience of psychotherapy. Whereas the letting go technique is about getting to the emotional, it's about sitting with the feeling that's underneath all thought and actually feeling the feeling. And by feeling the feeling all the way through, by actually allowing that emotion to be fully felt, that it basically alleviates the entire problem. And what he says is, if the goal of psychotherapy is to have a more healthily adjusted ego, the goal of the letting go technique is to dissolve the ego entirely. He says the goal is nothing less than oneness with all that is. And he describes very eloquently in the book an experience where that's exactly what he experienced. And it was just really interesting to me to think about the kind of juxtaposition of those two systems and those two goals, those two outcomes of these two processes. He says that one of the pitfalls of psychotherapy is that psychotherapy can often reveals what's underneath a given pattern of behavior or a given pattern of emotion, and that a lot of times we can get the satisfaction of gaining an intellectual understanding of what's going on, but that's also one of the downsides of psychotherapy, because a lot of times that will be enough to sort of satisfy us, and we don't actually get all the way to the emotional root of the problem. The emotional roots, the emotional core is often avoided. He talks about how you kind of like, it'll sometimes be felt, but it won't be entered fully in psychotherapy. And again, that's, we're working right now with an amazing therapist with whom I don't see that as being so much the case, but it's certainly my experience of most of the psychotherapy I've had in my life, is that the emotional core is kind of, it's treated courteously. We're courteous with each other about how much of that we're going to unpack in a session. And there's a kind of like, again, I don't want to be saying this and sort of like wholesale discounting all psychotherapists or all psychotherapy, but I found this sort of juxtaposition of these two systems really, it spoke to my experience. It rings true in my experience. And what was so interesting about it is that it's exactly what I've been saying about piano, because piano is also a process of basically, for all intents and purposes, it's like the psychotherapy, it's in the psychotherapy camp, in that what we're doing when we're learning piano, the process of learning piano is going from programming and patterns in our physical body, in our thinking, whatever, that don't work into patterns of thinking, processing, action, engagement that are more effective. That, and I emphasize to my students, on piano, no, you're not going to learn to play a piece without programming a pattern. That's exactly what we're doing. We're programming a neural pattern, a classical piece. We're learning something, and even if it's a jazz piece, we're still learning we're learning the structure of the piece and ingraining that structure so that now we have the freedom to improvise over it. And sure, we might come up with something new every time we improvise, but we're still gaining the freedom to do that by ingraining the pattern of, the harmony and the structure of the tune. So piano is about creating healthier and more effective patterns. And that's why I think I came to the conclusion, a while back now, that piano has to be the second priority in my life, and the top priority has to be doing this deeper work, this essentially, what David Hawkins calls the letting go work, or what any number of other spiritual teachers would call spiritual work, of going deeply into our patterns and feeling what's there, knowing that what is there is always being given to us as the next step in our own revelation, our own evolution, and that what's there is all there is. Let it, and that by feeling into whatever we are feeling, I keep saying this to my students too, and to myself, which is that anything that is there, feeling it is the healing process. Actually going deeply into it is the process of differentiating ourselves, our conscious self, from the feeling, and letting that feeling be felt, and at the same time understanding that it's not all we are. It doesn't define us. Our identity is not defined by this feeling. I think that's why sometimes feelings are so compelling, is because they grip us, body, mind, and soul, and we feel like we are the feeling. The feeling is us, and so we get afraid, and we're not sure if we can handle going all the way into the feeling. But of course, when we do, we discover that we are free, radically free, categorically free consciousness, and that the feeling is just an experience, and most of the time a conditioned experience. It comes from our conditioning, it comes from our patterning. So it was just really interesting to hear David Hawkins articulate it that way, about the goals of psychotherapy versus the goals of letting go, and having basically made that same distinction in my own life, and now making that distinction for my students, talking explicitly about this piano course. In this piano course, piano is our second priority. There's a higher priority, which is our engagement with our entire self, as we enter this process, and what comes up in that, and following that, really like leaning into that, and really letting that process be the thing that we are most committed to, in a way, because the great thing is, piano brings up all this stuff immediately to be reckoned with and to be worked with in this way. So it's an amazing venue for this work, and it's I think in many ways a very, very valuable practice. It's a form of meditative discipline that is incredibly applicable and incredibly informative and skill building as far as spiritual work goes, but it's not the spiritual work. It's still piano. and it's still this, it's still the process of moving towards healthier and healthier patterns ultimately. Again, because those are the patterns that give us the ability to do what we need to do on the piano, what we want to do on the piano. So it's just been fun to it was fun to hear that earlier. I was listening to the Audible. It was fun to just have that idea go in my head, and I was like, boom, wow, that's exactly what I've been feeling and thinking and saying, and that's where I'm coming from. And it kind of crystallizes that distinction for me, and also clarifies even more what I'm doing here, and what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the different layers of work in this course and in music in general. So yeah, it's a good afternoon. It's fun to have that pop up in my mind. So I love you all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you tomorrow.